Morgan Freeman walks into a luxury car dealership disguised as a retiree. What happens? Next shocks everyone. The Beverly Hills showroom gleamed under the bright afternoon sun, its massive glass windows showcasing the finest luxury cars money could buy. Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, and Aston Martins lined the pristine floor, each one polished to perfection, each one waiting for the next wealthy buyer to claim it. Inside, the air was thick with exclusivity. Salesmen in tailored suits hovered around potential clients, flashing rehearsed smiles, their eyes scanning for signs of wealth. Designer watches, expensive shoes, the subtle but unmistakable presence of money. And that was when he walked in. An older man dressed in simple slacks, a worn-out coat, and a pair of ordinary loafers. His slow, deliberate steps contrasted with the showroom's fast-paced energy. Does wealth define respect? Comment 1 for no, 0 for yes. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. He wasn't accompanied by a team of financial advisors or personal assistants. To Bradley, the sharp-tongued, commission-hungry salesman who prided himself on catering to only the richest clients, the man was a waste of time. "Sir," Bradley greeted, barely concealing his disinterest, "can I help you find something affordable?" The older man stopped, his fingers lightly grazing the sleek hood of a Rolls-Royce Phantom. "Actually," he said in a smooth, unhurried voice, "I was thinking about something like this." Bradley's forced politeness vanished. "This," he let out a short laugh. "Sir, do you know how much this car costs?" The older man's lips curled into a subtle smile. "I have an idea." Bradley rolled his eyes, scanning the man's attire once more before shaking his head. "Let me show you something more in your price range." The air shifted. Something about the way the older man looked at Bradley, calm, unwavering, almost amused, made the salesman feel strangely uneasy, and that was when Bradley made the worst mistake of his career. The silence stretched across the showroom, thick and suffocating. Bradley's mouth was slightly open, his brain scrambling to process what had just happened. Morgan Freeman. Not just any customer, not just some old man who had wandered in from the street. Morgan Freeman, the Hollywood legend, the man whose voice could command a room, the kind of presence that made people listen without even trying. And Bradley had just treated him like a nobody. For a split second, Bradley's entire demeanor shifted. His body tensed, his confident smirk evaporated, and his hands, so used to making grand gestures, to leading conversations, were now gripping the edge of the counter like a lifeline. His instincts, honed over years of dealing with high-profile clients, screamed at him to backpedal. "Mr. Freeman," he blurted out, voice suddenly an octave higher. Of course, welcome, sir. Please forgive any misunderstandings." The energy in the showroom shifted. Employees who had been watching from a distance were now whispering to each other, exchanging wide-eyed glances. Sophia, who had been watching with quiet unease, felt a strange mix of satisfaction and second-hand embarrassment. For years she had watched Bradley judge customers, deciding who was worthy of his time based purely on their appearance. And now? Now he had just made a fool of himself in front of someone who could destroy his entire career with a single phone call. Bradley forced a smile, stepping forward quickly as if he could erase the last few minutes by sheer willpower. "Mr. Freeman, had I known it was you, I would have—" Morgan raised a hand, not harshly, not in anger, but in a way that instantly silenced the nervous salesman. "Tell me something, Bradley," he said, his voice smooth, steady, unshaken. "Would you have treated me differently if I had walked in here wearing a $10,000 suit?" Bradley froze, because they both already knew the answer. Morgan let the silence stretch for a moment longer, watching as Bradley's face paled slightly. Bradley stammered, his usual quick wit utterly failing him. Morgan tilted his head slightly, as if studying him, before glancing around the showroom. "Tell me," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime understanding human nature, How many other people have walked into this showroom and been turned away before they even had the chance to prove themselves? The question landed like a hammer on glass. Sophia held her breath. The other employees shifted uncomfortably. And Bradley? Bradley had no answer. For the first time, Bradley was no longer in control of the conversation. For years, he had crafted a persona built on dominance. He decided who was worth his time, who deserved attention, who would get his best effort. But now he was the one scrambling for footing. I was just doing my job, sir, Bradley finally said, his voice lacking the arrogance it had held just moments ago. Morgan's gaze didn't waver. And what exactly do you believe your job is? He asked, his voice measured, thoughtful, yet sharp enough to cut through the air like a blade. Bradley swallowed. To sell cars, he said quickly, as if it were the safest answer. Morgan smiled slightly. No, he said simply. Bradley blinked. Excuse me? Morgan stepped forward, placing a hand gently on the hood of the Rolls-Royce Phantom, the same car Bradley had mocked him for even looking at. Your job, he said, his voice quieter now, but somehow more powerful than ever, is to serve people with dignity, to recognize potential in those who walk through these doors, regardless of how they're dressed, regardless of how much they flaunt their wealth. The words hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. Bradley felt the weight of them settle onto his shoulders. Because the truth was, he had never seen his job that way. He had never thought beyond the numbers, beyond the commissions, beyond the immediate payoff of landing a high-profile sale. And now, in front of a legend, his shallow approach had been exposed for what it truly was. Hollow. The silence stretched, but this time, Bradley didn't try to fill it. There was nothing left to say. Morgan exhaled slowly, almost as if he could see the exact moment Bradley realized the consequences of his own arrogance. He turned slightly, glancing toward Sophia, the one employee who had never joined in Bradley's mockery, who had stood on the sidelines, silently watching, waiting. "And you?" he asked her, his voice softer now. Sophia felt her heart skip a beat. "Me?" she echoed, suddenly feeling every pair of eyes in the room on her. Morgan nodded. "You didn't laugh," he observed. "Why?" Sophia hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Because," she started, then took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Because I don't believe wealth determines worth." The words were simple, but they carried more weight than anything Bradley had said all day. Morgan studied her for a moment, then, for the first time since walking into the showroom, he smiled. It was small, subtle, but undeniably genuine. He nodded once, as if confirming something he had already suspected. And then, with a calmness that sent a chill down Bradley's spine, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I'd like to speak with the owner of this dealership," he said simply. Bradley felt his stomach drop. The energy in the showroom shifted again. Not with judgment, not with anger, but with a quiet understanding that whatever was about to happen next would be irreversible. The employees who had once whispered behind Bradley's back were now staring in silent anticipation, because everyone knew when a man like Morgan Freeman asks to speak with the owner, it's not just a conversation, it's a reckoning. Bradley's hands began to shake slightly as he took a small step back. "Mr. Freeman, he started but stopped himself, because he knew. It was too late. Too late to apologize. Too late to take back the condescension, the arrogance, the dismissal. Too late to undo the mistake of underestimating a man who had never needed to prove himself to anyone. Morgan simply watched him for a moment, then turned his attention back to Sophia. "I think," he said slowly, "that it's time this dealership reevaluates who they choose to represent them." And as he spoke, Bradley felt the ground beneath him shift in a way that told him his career would never be the same again. The air inside the showroom had changed. The moment Morgan Freeman revealed his identity, the weight of the realization hit Bradley like a freight train. Everything, the arrogance, the condescension, the smug little comments, had all been directed at one of the most respected men in the world. And now there was no undoing it. A thick, suffocating silence filled the space between them, stretching out so long that even the customers browsing the showroom began to take notice. The other employees, once amused by Bradley's treatment of the old man, now stood frozen, their expressions shifting from amusement to outright horror. Sophia remained behind the counter, watching everything unfold. Her heart pounded, not just from secondhand embarrassment for Bradley, but from the sheer gravity of what was happening. She had suspected that the older man was important, but she hadn't expected this. Morgan Freeman, one of the most recognized, respected, and influential figures alive. And Bradley. Bradley had just insulted him to his face. Bradley's mind raced, scrambling for a way out, a way to fix what had just happened. His first instinct was to backpedal. "Mr. Freeman, I had no idea. If I had known, I would have..." But Morgan lifted a hand. Not in anger, not in frustration, but with a calmness that somehow held more power than any outburst ever could. "And that," he said smoothly, "is exactly the problem." Bradley froze. Morgan turned slightly, glancing around the showroom, letting his gaze settle on the other employees, the luxury cars, the velvet ropes that separated the true VIP section from the rest of the showroom. "Let me ask you something, son," he said, his voice even, controlled, but undeniably firm. "If I had walked in here wearing a tailored suit, flashing a Rolex, would you have treated me the same way?" Bradley felt his stomach twist, because there was no way to answer that without admitting the truth. Morgan didn't wait for a response. "You see," he continued, "respect isn't something that should be determined by a price tag, and yet here we are." He let the words sink in. "You assumed I was beneath your time, that I wasn't worthy of your attention. And why? Because I wasn't dressed the way you expected a wealthy man to be?" Bradley opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing he could say, because Morgan Freeman had just exposed him in front of everyone. Morgan didn't raise his voice, he didn't have to. And yet the sheer presence of his words commanded the entire room. Even Richard Coleman, the owner of the dealership, had noticed the scene unfolding from his office upstairs. He descended the sleek, spiraling staircase with measured steps, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, looking between Bradley and Morgan. Sophia braced herself, because whatever happened next was going to change everything. Bradley swallowed hard, desperate to regain control of the situation. "No problem, sir," he blurted out quickly, forcing a laugh that sounded painfully unnatural. "Just a little misunderstanding. Mr. Freeman here was interested in a vehicle and I..." Morgan cut him off with a simple, steady gaze. "A misunderstanding," he repeated as if testing the word. "Interesting choice." Richard frowned slightly. He wasn't a man who tolerated incompetence. "Perhaps we should hear Mr. Freeman's version," he said, turning to the legendary actor. "Mr. Freeman, is there something I should be aware of?" Morgan exhaled slowly, folding his hands in front of him. "I came in looking for a car," he said, his voice smooth, deliberate. "I wasn't dressed in a way that met your salesman's expectations, so I was dismissed before I ever had the chance to be a customer." The room went completely still. Bradley felt all the color drain from his face. Richard's eyes darkened. "Is this true?" he asked, turning to Bradley. Bradley's throat went dry. He felt the judgment of every person in the showroom pressing down on him like an unbearable weight. He could lie, he could try to twist the story, but the truth was standing right in front of him, and everyone had seen it. Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. "Bradley," he said finally, his voice heavy with disappointment, "how long have you worked here?" "7 years, sir," Bradley answered weakly. "And in those 7 years," Richard continued, "how many clients have you turned away because they didn't look wealthy enough for you?" Bradley's heart pounded in his chest. I don't know, sir," he admitted. "You don't know," Richard repeated, shaking his head. "That's the problem." Bradley could feel it slipping away. Everything. The years he had spent building his reputation, securing top commissions, being the top salesman in the showroom. All of it. Gone in an instant. Richard turned to Morgan. "Mr. Freeman," he said, "I sincerely apologize for what happened today. This is not how we conduct business." Morgan studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I appreciate that," he said simply. Richard then turned back to Bradley, and the final blow fell. "Bradley," he said, his voice firm, final, "you're fired." Bradley staggered back as if he had been struck. "Sir, please." "No," Richard cut him off. "I won't have someone representing my dealership who believes wealth is only worth acknowledging when it's visible." The silence was deafening. Morgan watched as Bradley processed the weight of his downfall. No one spoke. No one defended him, because everyone knew that this was the consequence of his own choices. Sophia, standing behind the reception desk, felt a chill go down her spine. She had always known Bradley's arrogance would catch up to him one day. She just hadn't expected it to happen this spectacularly. Morgan, ever composed, ever patient, simply turned to Richard and extended a hand. "Thank you," he said, shaking the owner's hand firmly. "And Sophia," Morgan added, turning to her. Sophia's eyes widened. "Yes, sir," she asked hesitantly. Morgan smiled. "I think you have a future in this business, Keach," he said. "A future where people are valued for more than just their appearance." Sophia felt her breath hitch. Richard glanced at her, then back at Morgan, nodding slightly. "I agree," he said. As Bradley walked out for the last time, the realization sank in. Everything he had lost tonight wasn't just a job, it was a lesson he should have learned long ago. Respect isn't dictated by wealth, and those who think otherwise, eventually they learn the hard way. Bradley stood just outside the dealership, the cold reality of what had just happened settling in his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the showroom floor, the same floor where, just hours ago, he had felt untouchable. Now, he was nothing. The parking lot that had once felt like a space of victory, a place where he had strutted after landing a six-figure sale, now felt hostile, unfamiliar. He was no longer the top salesman, no longer the untouchable king of commissions. He had spent years believing that power was in perception, that status was in appearance, that worth was dictated by wealth. But tonight, he had been proven wrong. Morgan Freeman hadn't needed to raise his voice, hadn't needed to throw his money around or prove anything at all. And yet, he had dismantled Bradley's entire belief system in the span of a single conversation. Not with anger, not with insults, but with something far more powerful. Truth. Bradley's hands trembled as he reached for his phone, scrolling aimlessly through his contacts as if an answer could be found in the endless list of names. There was no one to call, no one to fix this. His career, the one thing that had made him feel important, the thing that had defined his identity, was over. And it hadn't been stolen from him. He had destroyed it himself, not in a single moment, but in years of misjudging people, years of assuming he could tell a person's worth by the brand of their shoes or the price tag on their watch. For the first time in his life, he wondered how many great opportunities he had lost because of his own arrogance. How many deals had slipped away because he had dismissed the wrong person? How many relationships had he ruined before they even had a chance to begin? And the worst part? How many people had walked into that showroom full of excitement, full of dreams, only to be crushed by his assumption that they weren't worth his time? The weight of it was suffocating. Back inside the showroom, the energy was different. Sophia, still standing behind the counter, watched as Richard shook hands with Morgan Freeman, his expression no longer one of a dealership owner trying to appease a high-profile client, but of a man who had just received a reality check he wouldn't soon forget. "I'll be making some changes around here," Richard said finally, glancing back toward the stunned employees still standing in awkward silence. Morgan simply smiled. "That's the thing about change," he said. "It starts with seeing things clearly." His gaze flickered toward Sophia, a small nod of approval in her direction. Richard followed his glance, studying her for a moment before turning back to Morgan. "And you were right," he admitted. "We do need people who see things differently. Sophia, I'd like to talk about a management position." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. "Sir?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Richard nodded. You saw the truth before any of us did. That's leadership, and that's exactly what this business needs. Morgan's smile widened just slightly, the kind of smile that said he had seen this coming all along. Outside, Bradley stood in the cold air, staring at the street, not knowing where to go next. A car pulled up beside him. Not a Rolls-Royce, not a Bentley, but a simple black SUV. The window rolled down, and Morgan Freeman's unmistakable voice cut through the stillness. "You know," he said, his voice as steady as ever, "this doesn't have to be the end of you." Bradley turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "I lost everything," he admitted, his voice raw. Morgan studied him for a long moment before shaking his head. "No," he corrected, "you lost an illusion, and now you have a choice. You can learn from it, or you can let it destroy you." Bradley swallowed hard. For the first time all day, he didn't try to argue, because deep down he knew Morgan was right. "What if it's too late?" Bradley asked, his voice quieter now. Morgan's eyes softened just slightly. "The only thing that makes it too late," he said, "is refusing to change." He let those words sink in before rolling the window back up and driving away, leaving Bradley standing alone, but for the first time truly seeing himself. Through this story, we realize that true value isn't something you wear and power isn't something you flaunt. Bradley thought wealth determined respect, that status was something people had to prove, but tonight he learned that real greatness doesn't announce itself. It simply exists. Morgan Freeman didn't just walk into a showroom, he walked into a moment that would change the way an entire business saw its customers. And more importantly, he walked into a lesson that Bradley would carry with him for the rest of his life. Because at the end of the day, a job can be taken away. A reputation can crumble. But the way you treat people, that will always be remembered.